Right. Welcome everybody to another great TLC conversation. Today we get to talk to Cory Underwood. Yay! He's very well, oh, that was cute. Both Mel and Val at the same time. He's very well known in the industry as, one of the most prolific support people and people to answer all of your questions on every channel that he's engaged with, from the measured Slack to the DAA to the TLC and beyond. I'm sure there's millions of others I don't even know about because I'm not involved in them. And big news for those of you who didn't see on my can you call it a LinkedIn brag? My post on LinkedIn, SDI just hired him. So he started how long have you been here? 3 weeks? 4?
5.
5? Really?
5, yeah.
Oh, so much time has passed. Anyway, he's a new SDIer. So yay. Thank you, Cory, for being here, for agreeing to share this amazing talk about the impacts of changes in browsers based on privacy laws and other reasons, and how that's going to impact all of us. Before I hand it over to you, I do want to just give a shout out to all of my friends and clients in the industry that are being negatively impacted. Got word today about a very dear friend and clients that are being furloughed. We love you guys. I know this is a terrible time. Let's all support each other. Reach out to people who are furloughed right now. See if you can lift them up. This community exists so that we can teach and learn, but also support each other. So don't hesitate, those of you who just want to chat, want to stay connected, or let's help each other find jobs or contract work while we're furloughed or whatever. But let's support each other. This is a tough time, and we really do love you guys. Cory, I am going to stop share and pass it to you, sir.
Is that coming through?
It's perfect.
Sweet. So my talk is the phantoms you may encounter while testing, carrying on with the ghost theme that I have seen present in multiple presentations. And I am planning to talk about who I am, the state of the industry, some examples of storage impacts for that browsers have put into place, some device reporting changes that you are likely to be encountering, some possible solutions that may be present, some things that I'm currently tracking that might be haunting you down the road, and providing a list of resources that you can use to follow along as things continue to change. So who am I? It's a good question. I'm a platform engineer for search discovery. For the past 8 years, I've done development work, acting as a tech lead for A/B testing, analytics, personalization, and privacy efforts. I have a blog where I talk about such things. And I hang out in all of the channels that Kelly has mentioned, and I probably type way too much.
It's not, but I do want to go back, flip back. Everybody take a second, somebody write that down. underwood.dev. It has more information about everything that Cory's going to talk about and a whole bunch of other stuff than any of us would ever be able to learn in a lifetime. Cory just intuitively gets it and does a really good job explaining it. I promise you won't regret following that blog. Okay, I'm sorry. You may go.
It's okay. So don't panic, because a lot of what I'm talking about might sound scary. It may not apply to you because your company may have deployed your software differently. And if you are concerned, you should reach out to people, either your vendors or your agencies or your internal staff, and you should find out what's going on before you panic. But the main goal here is saying that not keeping up with the browser privacy changes risks experiment breakage, inaccurate data, and velocity delays. Because if the code doesn't perform like you're expecting it to, the experiment might not be working like you expect it to. Alternatively, it could be working, but the data you're recording could be wrong. And if you're trying to find all of that on the back half after you're doing analysis, like what went wrong, that's going to slow down all of your planning and development for tests going forward while you try to figure out just what broke. So let's look at the state of the industry. 2019, we had In January, Safari released ITP, which put the 2.1, which put caps on first-party cookies. And then in May, it released updates to that also put restrictions on local storage, but just for mobile because desktop hadn't been patched yet. We saw privacy policies come out of Firefox and WebKit, which is Safari. We saw Microsoft say that they're going to put anti-tracking tech on by default within Microsoft Edge. Google came out with some things that they're floating as possibilities. Then September hit and we got Safari 13. Safari 13 put the local storage restrictions on desktop, which brought it in alignment with mobile. Then in November, Brave launched. And you might not have heard of Brave because Brave doesn't appear in your reporting because Brave pretends it's Chrome. It also blocks a lot of tracking tech, and that includes most A/B testing platforms. It also has about 12 million members using it monthly as of 3 weeks ago. So 3.5 million daily, I believe the actual number was. Probably it's in your traffic. They're probably not seeing any of your test variations. They're also not getting counted. But it's important to know that there is some large holdout group potentially in your traffic set. In December, Safari again upgraded ITP. And later in December, it confirmed some user agent changes that have taken place for Safari. January rolled around, and then the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, went into effect. It's still not enforced yet. They're still working through the final regulatory requirements, but that went on the books. Then in the middle of January, Edge deployed its new Chromium version. And the anti-tracking tech that had been described the previous June went into effect by default. Then we move into February. Chrome's previously announced from the prior June same-site cookie changes went into effect, which impacted third-party communications. And then earlier this week, Safari again upgraded intelligent tracking prevention. So we have a lot of changes, but the delay between them is shrinking. And the important thing to realize is all the browsers are doing something slightly different. So even though they're all advancing on a privacy initiative, they're not doing it in the same way, which makes working around any of the possible restrictions that they put into place that much more difficult. So, things that you can find haunting your segmentation strategies. It's becoming a little more difficult to identify your users consistently because all of this tech that the browsers are putting into place makes it more difficult to recognize people coming back unless they do something like self-identify by, say, logging in. So if you don't have a high login percentage, it's going to become a little bit more difficult to identify your guests. And from a testing perspective, if you can't establish that state of history, it might be more difficult to ensure they stay in the same segmentation. So things that you should recognize is that code won't always run as you might expect. There's different restrictions being put into place. So the same line of JavaScript in Firefox will function differently than it will in Chrome, which will function differently than it will in Safari. And that can result in resegmentation or unintended test behavior. So if you have a client-side test and it's setting some sort of cookie or some sort of state because it only wants to fire the widget once every 5 days, but you have other conditions available, maybe the Safari person sees that every time they come back. Maybe the Chrome person only sees it every 5 days. So you're going to have
session, Cory.
I'm sorry?
What about same session?
Same session.
That, like going from, say, based on a behavior that you take on entry, something you click on, and I'm going to use targeting after that, rules-based targeting based on the thing you did on the first page. Is there any risk of that being broken on subsequent?
Not with what I've currently been tracking. However, you should realize that some browsers are tinkering with the URL that you come in on. And so if you're using that as the qualification source, that might not be present.
That's a good point. Okay.
Then we get to automatic storage deletion, because some browsers like Safari and Brave will automatically purge or block cookies in client-side storage. So if I come in and I'm thrown into cell B and then I come back later, but some other condition has happened on the device that said, maybe we should get rid of that so people can't identify you down the road. I come back, maybe I'm in cell A or cell C. And that's always been a potential. People can go in and delete cookies or whatever other storage mechanisms. But it's fundamentally different when someone has to manually do it and when the system does it automatically for you. So prior, you had to have a user that was like, I don't want to be tracked, I'm going to go in and delete everything, or set up a new computer. Nowadays, they just have to close the browser and the browser does it behind the scenes. And they might not even realize it's happening. So how does that play out in targeting? So targeting tests will get more difficult in some scenarios, and I actually have a very good example of this that's likely impacting your existing analytics. So context is important. If you got these numbers, you might think everything is awesome. Apple's reporting nearly 6 billion in iPad sales in Q4. Well, Q1 for them, it's fourth quarter for most of the rest of the world. Apple reports that close to 60% of all iPads are using iPad OS, something that only released several months ago. And they reported that nearly 80% of all iPads in the last 4 years use it. So if you're looking at this and you're like, okay, well, we know iPad OS uses Safari 13. So there's a pretty good scenario here. It's a realistic one that any Safari user is likely to be on Safari 13. So if we build the test to be compatible with that, it's going to cover the majority of users. But then you go and you think everything might be broken because you see since September, when Safari 13 rolled out, you've gone from 73% of your tablet traffic to 58%. And you see that Chrome went from 14 to 21, but that's still a larger decline than Chrome had gain. And so now you're like, potentially, what's going on? You want, all your analysts to look into this, to dig through what might be going wrong, trying to identify where it's like the Safari users are abandoning or dropping off, or, you have your paid people looking and see if they're getting less exposure on Safari devices. And maybe you have your developers pour through the site, testing with Safari. What is going on? Something's broken. So all your tests are on hold while you try to figure this out, potentially. I don't know. So now you have to figure out, did the data I collect, is that wrong? So is this chart not correct? Or do you not understand what's going on in the larger industry context? So out of curiosity, who thinks the data was wrong? Anybody? Or who thinks they might not understand what's going on?
I always think I don't understand what's going on, but I also always doubt the data.
So what actually happened? Apple changed how iPads identify themselves. So in September, when they rolled out iPad OS, they changed the user agent on iPad to mimic Mac OS in most scenarios. They didn't actually confirm this, however, till December. So if you weren't paying attention to the iPad OS beta bug tickets, you could have spent close to 3 months trying to identify a bug on your site impacting Safari, which didn't actually exist. It's a lot of time. But how many people are like really paying attention to beta bug tickets of pending operating system upgrades? But this is kind of how the industry is going. Some browsers are very upfront. they're saying we're changing stuff 6 months from now, other browsers tell you at some point after they've already changed it. So we got a couple possible solutions. You can handle state differently. So a lot of the client-side platforms get impacted by Safari's intelligent tracking prevention because they use JavaScript to set cookie state or other storage state. But that might not be the only way you can do it. You could use tools like CNAME redirects, which is what Target recommends. You could use reverse proxy servers, which I've seen other vendors recommend. You could switch the whole thing to server-side testing or instead of client-side. There's other ways of doing it. So it's not like your testing platform is heavily impacted necessarily, but there's other ways that you can do the same stuff to where maybe you're not impacted at all. You want to work with the existing vendors because they might have issued guidance or have recommendations on how to work with this stuff. I know off the top of my head, Target, Convert, VWO, and Optimizely have all said in their documentation, hey, this is going to impact us in this way. Here's what you need to do to fix it. Now, you actually have to be aware that they're giving you that guidance and then do the thing you need to fix it. Because if you don't, you're still stuck with the problem. You should plan for further disruption because, as we've seen, the rate of change is extremely fast. You don't always get any sort of advanced warning. And as a result, you need to be testing that your platforms are working as you would expect them to on a fairly regular basis. You want to make sure that how you're collecting the data today means what it did last month. Because if you're now having to change how the data is collected, that could change how you have to interpret it. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So let's look at some stuff that could be coming down the pipe. Things that could cause you nightmares in the future. So multiple browsers want to look at ad attribution because they don't like that you can figure out who bought what down to the individual level. So they want to put into place technology that will change how that works. And this kind of ties into Google's plan to potentially eliminate third-party cookies by 2022. So what their goal here is that they have different solutions as the amount of data that this will collect, but they say, hey, we identified that you clicked on an ad and you come through the site. And then at some point after you check out, within like 48 hours, the system gets told that you made a sale, but it's not immediate and it's not to the person. It's just that the ad ultimately led to a sale at some point in that window, but it makes it a lot more fuzzy of a picture. And if this happens, and you're also looking at like the upper funnel leading into the test, all of that analysis is going to be impacted by that. That's something to know. Safari is pushing for an is logged in API because they want to delete all client-side storage when the user isn't logged in. They're holding discussions to find out if this could actually work. Now, testing requires some sort of state on the client, on the browser that the user's looking at to say, hey, I saw this variation, you should show me this variation again. If this goes into place for Safari, A/B testing for guests, I don't see how that would be possible. So it's very scary. I don't know if they're going to do it because I would just think that it's going to break a ton of things. But they're trying to figure out if they can.
Wow.
But in this scenario, what you'd have to do is not only get the person to self-identify and log in, but you'd have to know what variation they had on the server and then rebuild that on the client. So maybe it's going to happen. I don't know. But it is scary. And I'm just like, that's going to break so much stuff if that actually happens.
For sure.
you should know that you're probably not going to have all of the data that you do now. And one of the big things is referral data. You'll see that playing out over the next couple of months. So, if you're looking at the refer, what site did they come from? And it's like the domain name and then like the domain name path that was on this page here, what have you. A lot of the browsers are putting into place changes for how that works. So now you only get the domain name. So you won't know necessarily where on the site that they were on, they came from. So if you're looking at the refer for anything critical, you probably want to consider not doing that or look at alternatives.
Yeah.
Because that is going to go away. But that's not necessarily the only thing.
So before it goes away, now's the time for data scientists to be doing some predictive modeling of what other metrics they can look at that might be predictive of the things that we're able to track today that may go away tomorrow.
Right. And just other things that that they're probably looking at, because all the browsers have come and said they want to eliminate unintentional fingerprinting by sites.
Right.
And as they start to phase out those APIs and those data points, if you're using those for site functionality or for test configuration, you're not going to have access to them. So it's important to keep track of what's going on, because if you're looking at something that's going to go away, maybe that will change your design of how you want to execute. And that was most of my presentation, but I have a bunch of resources and I will put the deck link in chat. So Twitter, those are a bunch of different browsers that you can look at. There's the intent to ship link is a list of all of the browser changes that people are doing. You probably want to have to, it's more intended for developers, but if you read it, you can probably see if anything has cookie or privacy protection. Maybe that's something you want to pay attention to. The three lower ones are people that post about privacy stuff. The browser news, those are blogs for them. We've got personal blogs in the lower left-hand corner. Simo Ahava and I both post quite a bit about it. Tools, cookiestatus.com is a site that Simo runs, and it's all of the current and known pending changes to browsers. So if you want to know what's going on, you can go there for more of a deep dive. The browser developer consoles will actually be pretty straightforward and tell you if it's blocking or not transmitting something. It will throw as a warning or potentially an error. And then the platform documentation. So a lot of the vendors do update their platform documentation, but they might not advertise it. So maybe it's a good plan to check there periodically to see if anything's new in light of other things that you read elsewhere.
And Cory, can we send a copy of this deck to the TLC members?
You absolutely can.
Awesome. That way you guys don't have to
so she'll do that.
Try to hand type that, but I'll send them all out to you so that you have all these links.
That's what I have.
Val asked a good question. How do you recommend that we avoid going into the rabbit hole on data quality investigations when we see stuff like this? Where would we look for info? And she wanted to clarify because she's not going to read all the release notes that you do.
But she could read the release notes.
She could, but who's got time for that? They're very dry.
Moving, so she has time. That's actually a difficult conversation, because the ones that are best able to keep track of that would theoretically be the developers, right? So they're probably reading those types of notes, or at least being made aware of that stuff. But they have to also know how it impacts things upstream from them. And that's commonly something that the developers don't have insight into, because maybe they're not test developers, maybe they're not related to the analytics pipeline, etc. So they may read it, but not recognize the impact it has to the company.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other side, the analyst could read it and then potentially not understand what they're reading.
Yeah, we need the translators. Yeah.
So you really need
Like Cory.
someone
You need Cory. That's what we're getting down to.
Someone that's able to understand the technical thing, but then understand the impact of the analysis. And that's a role that hasn't been well defined for organizations in my experience, but that's going to become more important as they're trying to handle all of the different browser privacy changes and then also comply with the legal requirements like CCPA and GDPR.
So basically you're telling them they should reach out on the TLC Slack or the Measure Slack or Twitter, LinkedIn, or check out your C. Underwood for summaries of all release notes that are a little bit easier to read.
You probably could do that, yes. Measure Slack, that's something that will get Simo and I pretty fired up to answer you.
Yep. How do you identify volume of traffic from the Brave browser?
That's very tricky.
That's not an answer.
It's more that you identify what you can and then you assume what's left is either Brave or some other browser. So something that's not commonly understood is a lot of the testing platforms don't serve all your traffic because they all have their own supported browser list. And if you're underneath what those are, you don't get served anything. Even if you're serving a window to 100% of your traffic, it's not 100% of the site's traffic.
Interesting.
So Optimizely, for example, we'll go back to I think it's IE10. If you're on IE9, you don't get either variation, which by default means you have whatever the site had before. So it's kind of how you count. Now you should know that they come in the event that you can observe it, it's classified as Chrome. So you'd have to be able to.
Brave is?
It is. Brave is like, I'm Chrome. It's not Chrome, but it uses that as the.
Is he like they're like wearing a Chrome mask?
Yeah. So it's difficult because even when you can observe it, it might be lumped in under Chrome. So you would need to be able to figure out what it would be and then know that they're going to fight you on it because that's the goal is to make them look either unique but for a limited period of time. So then they're not a retargetable audience, or to make them look the same as everybody else. So you're basically going to be in an arms race to identify what section of Chrome traffic is likely Brave, and then to watch 3 months from now when Brave breaks that.
I heard that was also true of the new Edge.
The new Edge is slightly different. The new Edge has analytics on a separate list from general third-party tracking. So if it's analytics, it's probably going to let it through. The third-party tracking, it tends to block until you have enough site engagement. Site engagement is a behind-the-scenes score that's done on per device. And it's from how often you visit the site and how many links you interact with, etc. You have to build up a score. And then after you reach a score of like 4.1, they actually start allowing those systems to work properly.
Interesting. So they're assuming that if you're an active, engaging customer to a site,
agree with what the site's doing.
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting.
But for the people that just have like landing pages and they never expect repeat traffic, Edge is probably going to be a problem for them. If they're doing stuff with third-party tracking, like they want to do conversion measurement off AdWords, Edge will actively block some of those calls or the state for those calls.
Have you found any tools more or less flexible or adaptable or ready for the changes that have already happened or the changes that are coming?
Yes. So anybody doing site server-side testing is probably in a better state because they will have set the cookies in the state more likely in a way that was compatible with the different privacy initiatives.
Right.
With that said, I know Adobe Optimizely and VWO were very quick to update their documentation on how to like put forward mechanisms to allow their client-side implementation to continue to work. Some other vendors have been substantially less forthcoming,
Mm-hmm.
and they still don't mention that in their documentation anywhere. And if you have a lot of Safari traffic, that's something important for you to know. And right now, I think over the last year, Safari accounts for like 53% of mobile traffic. And even if your desktop percentage is 12, assuming that you have industry standard for mobile, it's still impacting greater than half your traffic.
Right. What about Google Optimize? How does it fare?
Optimize out of the box as a client-side tool is still subject to Safari's restrictions because of how it works. With that said, they do offer a way for you to interface with Optimize server-side. However, when you do that, you're now responsible for the variation coding and serving and the state management. So your developers would have to basically build an API that interface with Optimize to send analytics to Optimize, get the segmentation from Optimize, but then manage all of that state and the variation serving on their own. So it's a substantially heavier lift for companies that may not have developer resources.
Describe for us for a second how that is different from the way some of the, you mentioned earlier, the tools that you can use more natively server side. What are some of those tools and how are they different than what you just described for Optimize?
They're basically, so some of them would be that same sort of design where the developer is going in and manually managing the state and building the variations and talking with the remote testing service. Other tools, SiteSpec comes to mind, they sit in the flow differently. So they change the test in flight as opposed to either at generation or destination. But the net result is they still set the state the same way as it comes from the server. So even though the development platform is different and the requirements for working in it are different, you end up with the same end result on the user side.
And are the workarounds that you described that I think you said Target, Optimizely, and VWO that they have come up with and that they have promoted on their sites for their client-side solutions, are those workarounds likely to still work with the future changes that you were telling us might be happening?
Right. So based off what I've seen, yes. Now, there's two things that I'm currently monitoring to see if they get much more traction. If Safari does go forward with their is logged in, then that just breaks all kinds of things. That's going to be a worst case scenario for a number of different stuff. The other one that's interesting is Firefox has APIs in it that allow it to trace the CNAME redirects that might be in place, which is what Target recommends. And it lets you know that they're happening.
Now, the fact that it can track it means that they might also stop it.
I started to use those.
Yeah.
And what it does is it's like, okay, I'm allowed to go to here. Oh, wait, it's redirecting me. Where am I going? Oh, that's on my list. I'm not going to go there. So that's not default functionality in any browser yet, but Firefox has the underlying support that they could build that in.
Interesting. Val asked a really good question. Considering it might be hard right now to convince your organization to pay for a new testing tool and the new resources that would be required to get those tests shipped, what's your best advice to protect ourselves from making inaccurate calls?
You would want to figure out what testing platform you have and how compatible it is with the different changes. And if you find out it is currently being affected by it, is there an easy resolution that you could put into place without switching vendors?
Okay.
So, and if there's not, then you would have to work through that within your organization based off your specific browser mix, how likely you feel that's impacting you.
So is it true that any tool that's doing client side has to have a workaround?
If it doesn't, it will be subject to Safari's rules. And then if Safari is a sizable portion of your traffic, then that's something that you now need to account for.
Okay. And then, so if they're using a tool that has server-side capabilities, but they're not using the server-side capabilities of that tool, they're in the same situation as somebody using a tool that doesn't have server-side capabilities, correct?
Right. So if it can do server side, but you're only using the client side components of it, then you need to work through whatever process changes are required to switch to the alternative method of implementation.
Mm-hmm. So the server-side, more native server-side tools, you mentioned SideSpec, not because necessarily it's server-side, but because it's the way it delivers the content is different. Yes, they call it reverse proxy, but because it's neither, and it's not happening on the browser, that allows for it to work properly, even with Safari settings. Okay. How about some other tools that you haven't mentioned yet? Do you know anything about Split?
I do not.
How about
But if I saw their
Conductor?
documentation and it had descriptions in it, I could tell you what I thought.
Okay, so if anybody's using Split and you got questions, ask Cory. He'll go find it. How about Conductor?
We're using Split.
Who's that? Who said that?
Okay. Enrique.
Oh, hey, Enrique. And Enrique, have you seen any weird data come through yet with Safari customers?
Nope, we haven't. We're just starting to use it and trying to figure out. Yeah, just started. So I'm just saying yes, we're using it.
All right. Yeah. No, I hear you. How about Conductors, Cory?
So with their client side offering, they are impacted by the local storage restrictions. So the segmentation would get reset by 24 hours or 7 days, depending on the number of conditions when the user lands on the site. If you're using their server side offering, then you're managing the state in a way that it's not impacted.
Cool. What are other tools other people are using out there? This is your opportunity. If you guys have them, just post them in the TLC calls. I'll get to them in a minute. Can you give us an example? You gave us a brief example earlier of how it might impact a cross-session test. Can you come up with another example of how some of these changes could impact what you see in test results? Analytics seems a little bit easier for me to understand, but maybe if you think of like a retargeting example, like a return.
Retargeting largely works on third party, and my view on retargeting is it is not long for this world.
That's what I'm wondering, yeah.
Because Edge will block a lot of the data that has to get transmitted for retargeting to work correctly. Firefox will do the same. Third-party cookies are outright blocked in Safari. So it will work for Chrome, which is like 65% of market traffic, but that means it's still not working on 35. And then Chrome has even announced that they plan on breaking it within 2 years. So if there's no alternative tech in place when they finally go ahead and do that, retargeting is effectively over because you won't be able to identify the audience.
Christian's asking do you have any advice for Optimizely shops? Do they need?
Yes, they have a help guide on how to configure Optimizely to work with ITP, and you should be doing that if you're using their client-side tooling.
And we can put the link, Christian, in this TLC calls channel after. I think it's in your resources slide, right?
For vendor documentation, no, but I can get it.
Okay, we'll get it.
So that's kind of where I'm going with this. Some of these tools can be deployed multiple different ways. And it's important to recognize how it's deployed within your organization before you get like super concerned that what you've been reading isn't not correct. Because maybe the IT team, for one reason or other, deployed it in a way that it's not impacted.
What's been your experience with how the different vendors are responding to these changes and more importantly, probably communicating to everybody about, how these changes impact their product and our ability to test and learn?
So going back a year or so, I caught a couple of people flat-footed when I emailed them, and I was like, hey, how does your product deal with this? And they're like, we didn't even know that was coming. Not a good feeling. So they've ranged from that. I've had people come back and tell me, yes, you're correct. It won't work in Safari under those conditions, and we're not interested in fixing it. And I have had other companies really jump on stuff and say, you will have a blog out within 24 hours to 48 hours explaining how we're going to handle that. So it's really covering like the whole spectrum.
Okay. Val asked, so, besides sending people a recording to this presentation, how would you recommend that people in organizations, that teams, that people listening to this call that are worried, how would you recommend that they kick off this conversation? Like, who should they go to? And she said, especially tools can be deployed in a couple of different ways. How do they find out how their tool is deployed so that they can get their right answers? And then who do they ask the questions to?
You want to talk with your internal IT team to see how the tool is deployed if you don't know how to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
You would want to highlight the business impact probably, because I think that's probably how you're likely to get the most traction. If you just go to your IT team and you're like, did you know that this is broken? If we don't change it to be this other thing, they're going to be like, hey, it'll go on the list and we'll get to it maybe eventually.
So maybe they need to talk to an analyst to help estimate the potential impact of
Right. So
being broken.
IT team, like dedicated IT resourcing.
Right.
I would think you're going to get better traction explaining the limitations you're now under from not making these changes in a business context,
mm-hmm.
and then having more leverage from the business side working with the IT team.
Kelly, do you mind if I come off mute to drill into that a little more? So Cory, I come from, before I joined Search Discovery, I was in-house at American Medical Association Healthcare, and I was at UBS and Financial Services. And it took us so long to even decide on the implementation architecture that we had, that if I went back and I was like, hey, we need to make some changes, they'd be like, no, like, deal with it. So and that's exactly what I even highlighting the business impact. But what if you're working in a place where your implementation is the way it is because it has to be? Like, I dealt with a reverse proxy with Target for a long time and ended up building an in-house tool until we could get that fixed. But like, do you have any recommendations on specific talking points? Because I also appreciate the point that if you come in like guns blazing, like, here's what you've done wrong, that you're not going to make many friends either.
Right. So it's rough, but the design that they went with was likely based off their understanding of the scenario at the time. And it's not that they built it incorrectly, it's that the underlying architecture of the internet has shifted. And I think that's a really important point to make. It's like, I know you did this right, but now 14% of our traffic or 34% of our traffic or 60% of our traffic is not going to have the correct experience that we need to do our job because Apple decided that wasn't how they wanted their customers treated.
That's a great point. Like, the business requirements have completely changed because the scenarios are different. That's a great point.
Anybody else got any questions? We've got about 10 more minutes. I'm checking through our list of questions that people sent ahead of time. Oh, any guesses what the future holds? If we meet again in 5 years, what capabilities will be left for us to measure and optimize?
It's going to be so hard to figure that out. Just because 2 years ago, I wouldn't have said like half the stuff that's happened in the last 2 years is that would have likely happened.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that we're likely to see more regulatory compliance come into effect, particularly in the US. Because like the CCPA is like the big focus because that's like the world's fifth largest economy. But I mean, like, other states are going to adopt that, and short of a federal level plan, you're going to end up with having to comply with like a patchwork of laws. So I think that will be a big issue. Technically, I would fully expect there to be alternative tech developed for authentication and stuff, and I would think it's likely to see different technology become adopted and a phase out of cookies in general, rather than just third party. We're probably going to start to see them chip away at the reasons you would even use first party, and then finally get rid of it, would be my guess.
You know, we had a really interesting ethical debate about all these changes. I think, Val, you were part of the conversation. I think Mel was too, and with Matt Gershoff. And we were talking about, you know, all of the testing tools and analytics platforms are developing all of these workarounds so that we don't lose our ability to track and optimize for our customers, which is great. But the laws themselves have been put in place because our customers don't want us to do the things they perceived we were doing. So then the question becomes, if we're just building workarounds, obviously we're not, you know, following the intent of the law, even if everything you're doing is totally legal. So what if instead of trying to find our workarounds, what if we started thinking differently about the way we measure and test? Maybe, like, I know Val was totally joking and being sarcastic when she said, maybe we just exclude Safari. But, you know, hey, maybe Safari users have no interest in being tracked or optimized. And maybe the very fact of them choosing that browser. Now, Safari is a little different because it's you know, so close with Apple, but like Brave, if you're choosing to use Brave, maybe we shouldn't be testing. Is that a crazy?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And Safari is so difficult because people that install the non-default browser are substantially different than the general populace. And if you buy an iPhone, you have to really love Chrome or whatever other browser to go download that and just not use Safari.
Yeah.
And then even with that in mind, chances are if you have any sort of hybrid web view on the device, it's going to use Safari anyway. So,
I mean, like through a hybrid mobile app?
Right. They're probably going to invoke the native web window, which would be Safari.
Interesting.
So you're going to end up with a lot of Safari traffic. Now, are they deliberately saying I'm using an Apple product because I value privacy? I think that could be a hard sell to tell inference.
That one's pretty hard because normally it's I'm using Apple because I don't want to take my computer to, you know, the Geek Squad every year.
But the other thing is, if it's the default setting, then is the customer really making the choice?
Right. Yeah, great point.
So it's a good debate, I think, to have, and it's a good thing to keep in mind. And so I think what I would advise is, rather than entering an arms race with the browsers, trying to figure out ways to do things that you know that they're actively trying to break, figure out ways to do things that you're okay with that they're actually supportive of.
That's what I'm wondering, is if there's, you know, we have all kinds of testing that we've done, like retargeting, again, great example, that is going to become more difficult in the future. So what's the next step? What's the next way that we can target? It doesn't involve cross session. So obviously we can target based on same session behavior for the most part, it sounds like. Maybe stay away from the URL based rules. But, you know, what if we can look into ways, and if we put ourselves in our customer's shoes, and what can we do with their experience on the mobile apps and websites that will make their experience better and easier? And we focus our analytics tracking and our testing there, as opposed to let's ring the register. Because the end result, if you make it easier to use, they will ring the register. So maybe we shouldn't call ourselves CROs. We should call ourselves something related to customer satisfaction. I don't know what it is. Or
You
usability.
kind of saw like the arms race not play out well for vendors last year because like Safari's like they're going to put automatic deletion on first party cookies, and then they went to local storage, and then Safari's like, okay, well everyone just went to local storage, so we're going to cut the duration. We're going to systematically delete local storage too.
That's what it's
Right.
just like stair step approach. It's like every
Right,
time you
so
find a
it's just-
workaround, they get rid of it. So maybe we should stop trying to find the workaround.
Right, and so Safari's big thing is they don't want unintentional cross-site tracking, but they've actually said in their privacy policy, if you do stuff on the server instead of on the client, we're going to let you do it because the developers are aware of it. Their big thing is people that put tags in their tag managers, and then the tags do things that the company probably didn't necessarily agree to.
Oh, okay.
And that's
That makes
why
sense.
they're trying to break some of that.
That makes sense.
But they're like, if you went through the effort to route that through your hardware, then
You're at least aware of it and monitoring it. Can take ownership of it.
yeah.
Well, Cory, thank you so much. As always, a font of information. There's so much more to be had, more context for everybody. I will send out the deck. I will post the recording on the TLC. And when I send out the email with the deck, I will also send a link to this recording so you guys can share as much as needed. As always, I need topics and panelists. So please submit your ideas for yourselves or others that you would like to hear from. And our next talk will be in April at some point, still negotiating timing. We might end up having more than one. So, but if you guys have things that you really want to talk about, learn more about, hit me up, let me know. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Wash your hands.